The fire needed feeding. Boone Harker knew this before he opened his eyes, the way you know things when you have lived alone long enough that the cabin becomes an extension of you, its temperature, its sounds, the particular quality of light through the oilskin window telling him it was just past 5 in the morning and the cold outside had deepened overnight. He got up. Fed the fire. Put water on for coffee. These were the first 3 actions of every day, in that order, and had been for 3 years. After the coffee there would be the traps, 6 lines set in the timber to the east, checked every morning before the light was fully up. After that, whatever the day required, skinning, stretching, repairs to the cabin or the equipment, the slow and patient work of a life that asked nothing of him except attention. He had chosen this life deliberately. They assumed the solitude was something that had happened to him, the few people who knew enough to have opinions. It wasn't. He had looked at the alternatives and selected this one with the clear-eyed practicality of a man who has learned, at considerable cost, what he is not capable of sustaining. He had tried, after the war, to live among people. For years, 3 different towns. Each time the same thing. Someone looked at him too closely, or asked one question too many, and something in him closed like a door, and he packed what he owned and moved further from whatever center he had been trying to hold. The cabin in the valley below the unnamed peak in northern Wyoming was as far as he had gotten. He drank his coffee and went to check the traps. He smelled the snow before he saw the sky change, not the clean cold of ordinary winter air but something heavier, the atmosphere pressing down with the intent of a storm that had been building for days. He finished the last trapline faster than usual and came back up the ridge, calculating. 3 days of provisions. Firewood adequate. Cabin tight. He was crossing the lower edge of the clearing when he saw her. Far end of the meadow, moving north. Toward the cut in the ridge that looked, from a distance and to someone who didn't know this country, like a passage through. It was not a passage. It was a narrow descending canyon that in November with snow coming was not a route any person with accurate information would choose. She was carrying something against her chest. It took him a moment to understand the something was a child. Boone stood on the ridge. The woman was going the wrong way. The canyon would be dangerous within hours. She had a child. He went back to the cabin, took his coat, picked up the rifle, and went after her. He did not think about the 3 years. He thought about the canyon and how fast the snow was going to fall. He caught up with her at the rim. She heard him coming. He made no effort to be quiet, because the last thing a woman alone in the wilderness needed was a large man appearing silently behind her, and she turned with the alertness of someone who had recently had good reasons to be afraid of being followed. She was younger than he had expected. Late 20s. Dark hair coming loose from a braid, a coat adequate for town and not adequate for what was coming. The child on her hip was small, 2 years old at most, and looked at Boone with the round-eyed assessment of a child who has not yet learned to be afraid of strangers. Boone stopped 6 feet from her. He looked at the canyon behind her. He looked at the sky. Then he held out his arms for the child. She didn't move. He understood that. He waited. After a moment, she was reading him, doing the rapid and necessary calculation of a woman alone who has to decide in seconds whether a strange man is a threat or a help. She shifted the child from her hip and held her out. Boone took the girl. She was heavier than she looked and warm from being held, and she grabbed his coat collar with both hands with the grip of someone who had decided this was acceptable. He turned and started walking back toward the cabin. He heard Ada's footsteps behind him after a few seconds. Neither of them said anything. The cabin was warm by the time the first real snow began to fall, approximately 40 minutes after they arrived. Boone built the fire higher, found the extra blanket, set water to heat on the stove. The woman sat near the fire with the child in her lap and watched him move around the cabin with the expression of someone determining what category of situation they were in. Boone put dried venison in the pot with the water and some root vegetables stored for winter. He did this without looking at her, not because he was ignoring her but because the most useful thing he could offer right now was the demonstration that he was going to behave predictably. He set 2 bowls on the table. She looked at the bowls. She looked at him. He sat down and began to eat. After a moment she brought the child to the table and sat down and ate too. The snow against the window was the only sound. Her name was Ada Marsh, and she had been walking since the previous evening. She told him this on the second day, when the storm had settled in and the silence had become weighted enough that she seemed to feel it required addressing. She had left her husband's house in the settlement of Greer's Crossing, 14 miles south and east, with the child in a bag and the knowledge that if she stayed until morning she might not be in a condition to leave at all. She said this in the careful, edited language of someone who has learned to report facts without elaborating, and Boone, who had spent 3 years in silence but had not stopped reading what people weren't saying, heard the whole of it. He looked at the fire. "The storm will break in 2 days," he said. It was the first thing he had said since the canyon rim. His own voice sounded strange, rusty in the way of things that haven't been used. "I know," Ada said. She looked at her daughter asleep near the fire, the dog curled beside her. "I don't know where I'm going after that." "You don't have to decide tonight," Boone said. She looked at him as if this was not the response she'd expected. "No," she said. "I suppose not." She went back to watching her daughter sleep. Boone went back to the fire. The storm lasted 3 days. By the end of the first, Ada had learned the layout of the cabin well enough to move through it without watching her feet. Her daughter, whose name was Iris, and who had decided within the first hour that the dog was hers, had established a sovereign claim to the floor nearest the fire that Boone did not contest. By the end of the second day, Ada had reorganized the kitchen corner in a way that was more efficient than what Boone had. He noticed and said nothing, because she was right. By the third day they had, without discussing it, developed shared rhythms: who tended the fire in the morning, who handled Iris when she woke in the night, who sat where in the evening. Boone had spent 3 years building a life that required no adjustment for other people. The cabin had been an exact expression of himself, its order, its silence, its spareness. It was no longer spare. He found he did not mind as much as he would have predicted. He told her about the war on the evening of the second day, because she asked him, with the directness she brought to most things, why he lived this far from anyone. Sharpshooter. 3 years. The particular mathematics of what that meant, what you saw, what you did, the distance that was supposed to make it cleaner and didn't. She listened without looking away. He told her about the last engagement, a ridge in Virginia, spring of 1865, 3 weeks before the end. What he'd seen through the scope. What he'd done. What he'd understood in the moment after, not guilt only, but a total exhaustion with being a person capable of that kind of precision in service of that kind of purpose. He had put the rifle down after that engagement. The one beside the cabin door was for hunting. He had never looked through its scope. "You've been punishing yourself," Ada said when he finished. Not unkindly. "I've been being careful," he said. "With yourself?" "Careful not to want things I wasn't sure I should have." Ada looked at Iris, asleep with the dog. "That's a long time to be careful," she said. The fire shifted. Outside, the storm pressed with steady indifference. "I haven't been careful enough," Ada said quietly. A fact, not a complaint. "You were careful enough to leave," Boone said. "With Iris." That was the right careful. She looked at the fire for a long moment. "Yes," she said. "I suppose it was." The storm broke on the morning of the 4th day. Boone went out to assess, 2 branches down, the woodpile needing digging out from under 18 inches of snow, the traps to check and reset. Ordinary work. He came back in to find Ada at the stove, Iris on her hip, making something with the remaining flour and dried fruit. She looked up. "The road south will be impassable for at least a week," she said. "I checked the snow depth at the clearing's edge." "Yes," Boone said. "So we're here for another week at least." Yes. She looked at him with the direct, assessing look he had come to recognize. Is that all right? She asked. He took off his coat and hung it on the hook. I'll need to check the east trapline this afternoon, he said. You can come if you want. Iris too, if she's bundled enough. Ada looked at him for a moment. All right, she said. It was not an answer to the question she had asked. It was a better answer than the question had called for, and she seemed to understand that, because she turned back to the stove and didn't ask anything else. He had not spoken to anyone in 3 years. He had believed this was permanent, that the silence was not a season but a settlement, a final arrangement between himself and the world that required no renegotiation. He had been wrong, but not in the way he would have expected. He would have expected the end of the silence to feel like a loss. What it felt like instead was closer to a joint held rigid too long finally allowed to move, not painless, but the pain of restoration rather than damage. Ada Marsh had knocked on no door. She had been walking the wrong way toward a canyon that would have killed her, and he had gone after her because there was a child, and she had followed him back because there was nowhere else to go. None of it had been chosen the way significant things were supposed to be chosen. And yet, the fire needed feeding every morning. Iris needed someone to hold her when she cried at night and was not particular about which adult it was. The cabin that had been an exact expression of a man who needed nothing had become, in the space of a week, something closer to what he had actually wanted all along, before he had decided that wanting things was a risk he could not afford. She stayed through December. Through January. Through February. In March, when the valley thawed and the road south became passable, he waited each morning to see if today was the day she would say she was leaving. She didn't say it. On a morning in late March, Iris outside in the mud doing something important with a stick, he sat across from Ada with 2 cups of coffee and said the first thing in months that was not about the practical arrangements of the day. I don't want you to go, he said. Ada looked at her coffee. I know, she said. I'm not asking because of Iris. Or the winter. He stopped. The words were there. They had just not been used in a very long time and moved slowly. I'm asking because I want you to stay. Ada looked up. I know why you're asking, she said. Quietly. Without drama. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. Outside, Iris said something definitive to the stick. The valley was very green and very quiet, and Boone Harker, who had not spoken to anyone in 3 years, found that he had run out of reasons to stop.